All right, everyone, and welcome back to International Organization. And this week, it's a short week, but a lot of material. I can't believe that I assigned that much pages for you to read for just a one-week session. But the good news is that a lot of the material from the textbook on conflict resolution, I'm going to be honest, you can kind of skim through. So if you're one of those students that waits for the video first and then goes to the reading, that's probably the best news that you're going to hear all week for this class. No, I mean, in reality, a lot of the material from the textbook is good for reference material. But in terms of coming up with a couple of thematic arguments, showing the relationship between international organization and conflict resolution, you're in better shape just kind of sitting back, taking notes, and listening for the next hour and change. And as the title suggests, we are looking at the relationship between international institutionalism and global peacekeeping, and the role of IGOs, specifically the United Nations. So in so many words, we're looking at how international organizations and how international organization deals with growing cases of conflict resolution around the world. And while this is a very short section, it is connected to larger studies on conflict resolution that we do teach within the Poli-Sci department. In fact, some of you may have even have had a class on conflict resolution with my colleague, Dr. Fahmy. So consider this to be like a real crash course in how conflict resolutions are dealt with and why, and this is really the big question for the week, why conflicts rarely, if ever, get resolved. Right? The paradox in international approaches to conflict resolution is that much of the conflict ends up going from an active conflict to a frozen conflict. And there is a major difference in stopping the violence and ending the structural situations that, produce the violence, that produce the conflict. So there is a difference between conflict resolution, which is what we usually say, but conflict management, which is oftentimes what ends up being. So if any of you are interested in, going out into the world and working within areas of conflict resolution, the first thing to understand is that more often than not, conflict resolution solutions are little more than just patchwork. Right? There is little effort that is done, unfortunately, to get to the underlying conditions that led to the problems in the first place. And that isn't because organizations are lazy or that they're dysfunctional or that they're incapable, but that more often than not, conflict resolution takes years, decades, sometimes even generations to finally solve. And yes, at the risk of sounding rather flippant, you oftentimes have to wait for that generation that started the conflict to kind of die out, and wait for newer people to just kind of realize how irrational and problematic frozen conflicts and maintaining status quos happen to be. So that's really where I want to go in this lecture here. And, there are a number of issues that I would like to address. And, to the concept of conflict resolution, we have to understand the role of peacekeepers. Right? Military regiments, oftentimes, that are deployed to a hot zone to, in so many words, keep two or more combating sides apart. Right? It's kind of like the parent that is trying to keep the fighting siblings apart without really getting to the reasons why the fight broke out, but, simply sending one brother to one room and one sister to the other room and just kind of figuring out what to do with it later. Obviously, within larger, more optimistic theories of peacekeeping, there is a concerted effort. There are people who work within this field that truly believe in just moving beyond just ending the violence, but actually trying to reintegrate troubled zones back into, the states that they tried to, break away from, or even, more difficult, reintegrating people, right? If we're talking about, let's say, a civil war, one of the most difficult aspects of conflict resolution in a civil war is trying to get to trying to make the people that had been previously killing each other live together as neighbors again. And, oftentimes you have to separate them by region. You have to, maybe include some provisions of institutional autonomy for one group to keep them somewhat separate from the central government of another. But the idea here is to think about conflict resolution beyond the responsible governments that created the conflict, and think about the people, the nations. And when I say nation here, I'm talking about the ethnic group, the cultural group, the people that make up the region. They still have to live there. They still have to go about their daily lives. And, do we punish the entire nation as opposed to punishing, let's say, trespassing governments in that sense? Because if you punish the nation for something, well, then you're just going to prolong the conflict indefinitely. It was kind of like, the end of World War I. The peace agreements were that the German nation was responsible for the outbreak of the war. And that is just factually incorrect. Say what you want about Germany and Germany's role in the First World War, but they were not the perpetrators of that conflict. And to suggest that the German nation was responsible for the entire war created enough anger and resentment to lead to the outbreak of another world war, about 20 or so years later. The peace agreements of the Second World War, in which it was actually more legit to say that the German nation was responsible. I mean, we're talking about just an absolute collective mobilization behind Hitler. In this case, the peace agreements that ended the war in 1945 was much more strategic in thinking the German people are not to blame, but we're going to put all the blame, all of the focus on the Nazi government, right? We're going to, put the top leaders on trial. We will, convict them for a whole bunch of crimes against humanity, and they're going to basically take the bullet for the rest of the nation. Another thing to think about, and this is, getting a little bit more technical within studies of conflict resolution, and this is actually a very important part. So if you're kind of, dozing in and out right about now, you might want to write this stuff down, because this here is pretty much important. The evolution of conflict resolution from negative to positive peace, right? From negative to positive peace. Now, these are terms that are used within studies of conflict resolution to differentiate two different types of agreements. A negative peace is what we could effectively call the bare bones minimum standards of peacekeeping operations. A negative peace is simply stopping the violence, stopping the killing, ending the war. But little more than that. If we can get the bullets to stop flying, if we can get the people to stop dying, we're halfway there. I mean, it's a major accomplishment, don't get me wrong, but it is different from a positive peace, which not only does that, but looks to solve the problems, to get to the underlying issues that led to the outbreak of conflict in the first place. So to go back to the allegory of the parent wanting to just send the two, fighting siblings to their rooms, yelling at them, spanking them both, withholding dessert after dinner, whatever it is, and saying, just wait until your father gets home, and sending them to their rooms. Well, that's a negative piece, because you haven't really resolved anything, right? The kids could still be crying or screaming in their rooms, but, are they fighting with each other? No. But have you actually resolved anything? No. This is what most conflict resolution packages begin with, is if we can get the sides to stop fighting, that's considered to be enough to call it a day. But the problem with negative peace is that it runs a very high risk of breaking down in a few years, if not even a few months, in some cases even in a few hours, and violence resumes. So in order to make certain that violence does not return and that problems do not crop up again, a positive peace is something that needs to be looked to. And that brings in strategies of reconciliation, of altering statuses of certain minority groups, maybe even changing borders if need be. Positive peace takes a lot longer. They take years, sometimes even decades. Negative peace? Well, a negative peace lasts only as long as the violence stops. And, in some cases, you've got, let's say, the demilitarized zone on the North-South Korean border. I mean, that's a negative peace. But if anybody has ever been there or ever plans on going there, especially if you're coming from the South Korean side, you're given a whole bunch of lists and rules and regulations. If you're going to go to the border, you need to absolutely positively behave yourself. If you do anything stupid, if you try to intimidate or shout at the North Korean guards, not only will you be in severe trouble by South Korea, but, you could run the risk of pissing off North Korea as well. So that is more of a negative piece. It's just simply we're just kind of like, regrouping, reloading, licking our wounds, but we're still angry at the other side. And so in order to address a positive piece, we need to take this one step further and examine what are known as protracted social conflicts, right? Protracted social conflicts. Because in the study of conflict resolution, the outbreak of violence doesn't just happen because, but you can kind of reverse engineer and assume that if violence, if war, if ethnic cleansing, if civil war, if something happens, chances are there are a long list of problems and grievances and issues and challenges that existed well before that. So the outbreak of violence is just simply, the tip of the iceberg, right? The straw that broke the camel's back. In order to rectify the situations, right, people have to, people who, manage conflict resolutions have to study the region and find out what led two or more sides to go to war, right, to fight each other. So this is where we address protracted social conflicts. What have been the underlying issues? What have been the long-term standing grievances that led to the outbreak of violence? And in this situation, if we are to look for positive peace, well, then we need to look for solutions within a democratic framework. Right? There needs to be not just a treaty for ceasefire, but there needs to be a strategy for a long-term solution where both sides, two or more sides, they can at least, accept the terms. They're not going to be happy with it. Not every side is going to walk away with everything that they wanted. But if every side could walk away from the table thinking that they got more out of what they had to concede, well, then that's a step in the right direction. And at the absolute least, we can look forward to the next few years of some kind of reintegration, which may need to be revisited, in another 5-10 years to build on that. But it steps in the right direction. And so this is really where conflict resolution would like to go, right? Beyond just simply peacekeeping, but to peace building. Right? It's not enough to just simply, get a whole bunch of UN blue-helmeted soldiers or U.S. soldiers or increasingly now Russian soldiers to just enter an area, occupy it, and keep both sides at bay. Right? That costs money. That creates conditions of a frozen conflict. And it never really solves anything. In fact, it leaves tensions raw. It leaves both sides to kind of, over time, engage in their own, incestuous, collective memories about why my side is justified and the other side does nothing but engage in, war crimes. So if the goal is peace building, then we need to consider solutions of power sharing, regionalism, institutional integration, elements like that. We cannot go back to the status quo, right? You cannot just simply say, everybody go back to where you were before the outbreak happened and rethink your strategies. No, right? Oftentimes, when conflict resolution happens, the conflict itself, the war, the civil, whatever it happens to be, alters the status quo, right? There is no going back. So some people may make some territorial gains. Some villages may be depopulated. Others may be repopulated, whatever it happens to be, right? But oftentimes, we go from the current fault lines of where everybody is, and we just kind of build from there. It's a risky strategy to make because it, basically says we're not going back to beforehand, and that kind of leaves a whole bunch of things in flux. But in order to make certain that we are doing more than just simply keeping the peace, but we are building for something better so we don't go to war again, right? There's a difference between, let's say, peacekeeping between France and Germany at the end of World War I and peace building between France and Germany at the end of World War II, right? The peace agreements at the end of World War I all but guaranteed that at some point in the future, France and Germany would be at war again. The entire strategy of economic integration, the European coal and steel community, the foundations of what would eventually be the European Union have made conflict between France and Germany all but impossible, right? All but just never going to happen. I mean, it's not going to say it never will, but it's statistically so insignificant that we can consider the French-German border of 2020 to be one of the most pacified borders in the world. And that's a big difference between what it was in 1920. All right, so with all of that said, let's start at the end and work our way back. If the goal here is to think about peace building more than just simply peacekeeping, and if we're really interested in getting at the heart of the matter of what starts the problems, right, what creates the conflicts, okay, let's then look at one of the big pieces of literature within studies of conflict resolution, and that is the Management of Protracted Social Conflict by Edward Azar. It was published in the early 1990s, and I think was published at such an opportune time because within about a year or so, the general euphoria that the world had enjoyed following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and a whole bunch of single-party authoritarian states, gave way to the sobering realities of where we were. Civil war and fragmentation in Yugoslavia, regional conflicts within the Caucasus, ethnic cleansing and genocide in Rwanda, mass starvation, famine, and the beginning roots of global terrorism in Somalia. And then, of course, a few years later, we find, the spread of radical, ideological governments like the Taliban in Afghanistan, or in the rise of Al-Qaeda. The 90s become, much more problematic as years go by. And it becomes painfully obvious that conventional solutions to solving wars in traditional periods are no longer applicable. So what is Azar, getting at here? What are some of the elements that we need to understand when identifying protracted social conflict? The first thing to understand is the prominence of conflict within states, right? Within states, right? This is sort of the big thing now, is that much of the conflict, the wars, the fighting, the violence is not really happening between states, but are happening within. Civil wars, breakaway secessionist movements, threats of international global terrorism kind of setting up shop somewhere, right? And any of these things, right, kind of forces us to rewrite the playbook on the handbook of war studies here. And so when we talk about the prominence of conflict within states, we are looking at, in Azar's writing, the prolonged and often violent struggle by communal groups for such basic needs as security, recognition and acceptance, fair access to political institutions, and economic participation. Now, just with this alone, okay, and pause this video and write this down, because this kind of involves us considering the, for lack of a better term, stateness of states, right? How much the government governs, how deeply developed a state is. Because if we see, conditions where communal groups are struggling, sometimes violently, for basic needs of security, recognition, acceptance, fair access to political institutions, and economic participation, right? We're talking about weak states, right? Or failed states. We're talking about states that, in the best case scenario, function at the constitutional level, but actively work to demobilize and disenfranchise a certain geographic region, or even worse, a certain ethno-political community within that state. So, these are instances that, cause states to collapse, lead to internal conflicts, civil wars. And look, civil wars might be an internal issue, but if left unchecked, they can certainly drag in neighboring countries. And before you know it, right, before you, are able to somehow get a grasp on these things, an internal conflict becomes a multi-state involvement. And eventually, if left unchecked, right, these things risk bringing in larger, more militarily aggressive powers. So in this case, protracted social conflict is conflict that is based within racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural groups. Okay, if, let's say, states are working to democratize, right? Let's say that they are emerging from, long-term single-party authoritarian rule. Under the authoritarian regime, it's pretty obvious to understand, right? There is one group, one political faction that controls everybody else. And if this authoritarian faction identified as a specific ethnic, religious, or cultural group that worked to disenfranchise, demobilize, subordinate everyone else, well, within an authoritarian system, there's not much that really can be done. You just kind of, survive as best as you can. But when the element of democratization comes in and the pressures from globalization kind of necessitate the country to modernize and get onto the global market, and of course, if it's encouraged to do so by, certain large powers, the United States or, the UK or Germany or something else like that, right? There's a possibility that previously aggrieved groups may see this opportunity as a way of now asserting what they have felt are long denied rights and privileges. Now, in a perfect scenario, the central authorities that are running this, hypothetical country recognize the need for extending minority rights and other elements of cultural identity to previously aggrieved groups. But in the real world, that doesn't really happen. In the real world, central government authorities will do everything in their power to keep demobilized groups from mobilizing. But in an era of globalization, in an era of increasing information and the porousness of borders that previously were closed off, aggrieved organizations, groups, whatever, secessionist elements, think like, let's say, Kurds in Turkey or Albanians in Serbia, Armenians in Azerbaijan, just to give, a few examples here, are going to use this opportunity to somehow make their names known, in global information. And they're going to seek some kind of support, right? Some kind of assistance from the outside in either at the absolute best, asserting their rights for regional autonomy within a country, or, if all else fails, outright, territorial secession, either forming a new country of their own, or, declaring independence and kind of like Crimea, breaking away from, let's say, Ukraine, and then within 24 hours passing one law that wants them to be annexed to the parent mother country, like Russia. So, if it's, let's say, Armenians in Azerbaijan that want to be part of Armenia, or Albanians in Serbia that want to be part of Albania, or just Kurds across the entire region that just want to create a Kurdistan, right? These are, long-standing conflicts that are based within racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural axioms. And of course, all of these will be framed within some type of deprivation of human needs, poor security, lack of developmental investment, poor to non-existing infrastructure, denied or deferred resources, right? The group in question is going to somehow frame their grievances within a context of we are not just a discriminated minority within a country, but we are institutionally ignored. We are being literally isolated from the rest of the country because the idea is that the central authorities want to demobilize, disenfranchise, and demoralize all of us. So hence, we have no other recourse but to take up arms, seek international support, and ask for, some type of global assistance in our efforts at self-determination. If this happens, it is a clear sign that the state in question has little to no ability in properly governing, okay? And here we open up a whole new range of discussion about strong states versus weak states, even the concept of failed states, right? There's a lot of failed states in the world where, they look like a state on the map, they've got UN representation, but beyond that, right, there's little that the state in question can actually do for its people, because of either weak governments, fragile legitimacy, disputed ideologies, all of these little internal elements of decay that you wouldn't really notice unless you either A, went to the region, or B, studied it extensively, beyond a few Wikipedia entries. If the aggrieved group has some kind of international linkage or leverage, okay? And again, we're using the same type of linkage and leverage that we looked at with the European Union. They are able to somehow take their problems, and sometimes these problems might be superficial, but if we can somehow market them into something a lot more, like, the self-determination of a subjected people, people who want their own country, are seeking freedom and democracy, kind of like what America wanted against the British, just come up with some kind of crazy narrative like this, right? It has a very good chance of creating what we call neighborhood effects. Right? Neighborhood effects are, one aggrieved group in one country is going to kind of, galvanize, moralize, mobilize other aggrieved groups in other countries. So, let's say, for instance, maybe about, more than 15 or so years ago, right, with the collapse of the Ba'ath Party regime in Iraq, right, the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime, there is this very poignant moment where the Kurds of Iraq are now flexing their muscles for greater autonomy, self-determination, possibly even statehood, if nothing else happens. And this is, of course, going to have an enormous effect on the Kurdish populations of Turkey and Syria, and to a lesser extent, Iran. And so if, let's say, one group in one region is able to somehow, capitalize on global sympathy and support, if there, apparently is some kind of, support for, secessionism, independence, self-determination, whatever, right? It creates a domino effect, right? It creates this security dilemma, one would even say, that if it can happen and be supported for one group, then why shouldn't it happen for other groups as well, right? If Yugoslavia is breaking up, why shouldn't Romania break up? Why shouldn't, Iraq break up? If people are, and even within the emerging Yugoslav states, if, let's say, the ethnic Albanians of Kosovo want to break away from Serbia, why shouldn't the Armenians of Azerbaijan break away as well? Why shouldn't the Russians break away from Ukraine? Why shouldn't the Abkhazis break away from Georgia, right? You kind of see, it's like, it creates this, Pandora's box effect, or if it's good enough for you, well, then it should be good enough for me as well. And so this kind of adds to the larger understanding of protracted social conflict, in that it's not just about the war itself. It's not just about the actual physical violence that got one's attention, but that conflict is effectively the social struggle for democracy within non-democratic political and economic structures. So just by stopping the war, just by stopping the conflict, does not, on any circumstances, mean that everything is fine. But what protracted social conflict involves is that we have to look at the underlying effects, the underlying issues that led to the outbreak of conflict, of war, of violence, of secessionism, of civil war, of ethnic cleansing, of terrorism, of counterterrorism. Right? These things just don't happen for no apparent reason, but there are long-standing grievances that sometimes go back decades, maybe even centuries. And so if we're going to engage in conflict resolution, we've got to take a lot of these things into account. So it's not just the policymakers that can kind of just step in, like a marriage counselor. A marriage counselor, if a marriage counselor says to, two, couples, husband and wife, and says, look, I don't want to hear about any of your problems prior to you walking into this office. It's not really much of a marriage counselor, right? A marriage counselor, a therapist, whatever it is, they're going to want to know your backstory. They're going to want to know what brought you into their office that day. So this is the same thing with protracted social conflict, is that when negotiations happen, finally, in a region, and they are under the sponsorship of the UN or the EU or NATO or, a large country like the United States or Russia for that matter, in order to really provide a lasting positive peace, we need to look at what the elements of protracted social conflict are, so we know what to address, what to rectify, what to remedy. Okay. Now, with all of that said, right, let's take a very quick snapshot of current records of conflict resolution and peacekeeping, right? Sort of like a balance sheet, for good measure here. Since 1945. Efforts at halting conflict and searching for sustainable solutions for peace has been an internationalized responsibility. Okay? So, in other words, since the end of the Second World War, there has been, a redoubled effort by the international community to really invest in specific problems around the world. Okay? And even though addressing these conflicts might be initiated by a powerful state, whether it's the United States or the UK or France or increasingly more today, Russia, right? Powerful states might design the negotiations, but these negotiations need to be framed within international organization and international law. In other words, if a powerful country decides that they are going to take it upon themselves to be the mediator in a conflict, a regional conflict, an internal conflict, whatever, in order to make it stick, in order to make it legitimate, even the most powerful country needs to today rely on pre-existing principles of international law and international precedent. So in other words, it's not a case anymore where, the president of the United States or Vladimir Putin or whoever it is you want to say, right, kind of walks in and says, okay, you get this, you get that, I get this, we all call it a day. It doesn't happen anymore like that, right? Still, big powers might give you the impression that power politics still exists, but power politics needs to be linked as much as possible to international law and international precedent. And I think that this is increasingly important to note because since 1990, as I've already mentioned, conflict and violence have largely been internal matters instead of interstate. In that case, wars, violence, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, cases of genocide even, are largely internal matters, which, prior to, let's say, 1990, we kind of just looked at and wished that we could do something about. But, as long as it's an internal matter, there's not much that can happen. Because if the rest of the world does get itself involved, that's kind of seen as an invasion. Since 1990, that's no longer a problem. The United States has taken it upon itself to involve its own, conflict resolution processes in Bosnia, in Serbia, especially within Kosovo. They wanted to do something in Syria. They did involve themselves with, Iraq. Does this amount to full-scale invasion? Sure, it does. But within the concept of humanitarian intervention, of stopping the killing, of preventing further, violence, in that sense, right? And look, when the bipolar system of the Cold War has collapsed and, the U.S. enjoys its, decade or so of unipolar hegemony, they can do whatever they want. But what they end up doing is setting a precedent. So if the United States can involve itself in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s, well, Russia can involve itself in Georgia in the 2000s, and just recently, like hot off the press, in the Caucasus, within Armenia and Azerbaijan, within the last couple of days. And I'll get to that in a couple of minutes here. The other thing that we need to note about where we are today in terms of conflict resolution and peacekeeping is that solutions for resolving conflict has attempted to be inclusive and integrative of both winners and losers. Now, here is where things get a little complicated. Because, in the olden days, you just kind of picked the winning side and said, all right, they've got the leverage. We're going to allow them to dictate peace terms. And we'll just kind of, as the third party, the one that's managing everything, sort of sit back and make certain that they don't, get too full of themselves. Like we'll kind of guide them through the peace, agreements. That no longer works. In today's world, third-party arbiters will involve themselves in a 2-3-party conflict in order to make certain that everyone walks away from the table having secured something, right? Even if one side has clear leverage over the other, right? It is no longer a case where the losers in a conflict effectively have to sign a peace treaty and hand their fate over to someone else, okay? So more often than not, right, the best example of this is if it's an internal conflict that involves disputed territory, breakaway movements or whatever it is, the third-party arbiter will oftentimes, negotiate on behalf of the parent country and say that the territorial borders of this country will not change. Right? We're not going to change the borders on the map. However, the aggrieved group that is seeking some kind of self-determination should be given, at the absolute least, some kind of autonomy, some kind of regional autonomy in which they can, at the local day-to-day level, convince themselves that they're a separate entity, even though they are existing in another country. So it's sort of like a win-win situation, at least as far as the negotiation is concerned. Sometimes the groups do come out equal winners. Sometimes the groups come out, disappointed because neither of them got what they ultimately wanted. It could be some real muddled peace agreement that, one side is hoping to revisit on the battlefield at some point later on. But for the time being, right, it does try to get more to the institutional aspects of conflict resolution. And yet, with all of that said, and here is where, here's where the pessimism comes in, right? With all of that said, here we are in 2020, right? The outbreak of war between states, or increasingly within states, has been on the rise since 1990. Right? So you would think that, efforts at trying to mitigate conflict in various hot zones would somehow work. In actuality, there has been greater flare-ups, especially within the last decade or so. And these wars, often risk spreading into surrounding regions. So, whether it is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that threatens to bring in Turkey, Iran, and Russia, the conflict between, Serbia and Albanian separatists that threaten to bring in Greece and Turkey, the conflict within Ukraine that threatens to bring in, Russia full force. Wars oftentimes, take on lives of their own. And beyond just simply bringing in other countries, if left unchecked, they now have a greater chance of involving terrorist organizations as well. And I'm not just simply talking about the Islamic State. I am not just simply talking about Islamic militancy. I am talking about even within, let's say, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a whole bunch of voluntary mercenaries from around the world are finding cheap flights to go to eastern Ukraine and fight on either the Russian or the Ukrainian side, to the point where it actually had gotten to, I think there was one example of a plane that flew out of the Balkans to Ukraine, and it was full of Serbian and Croatian militants, all basically riding the same plane. The Croats were going to go fight for the Ukrainians, the Serbs are going to go fight for the Russians, and not to, of course, not to bring in the idea that Syria today, Iraq, and a number of other failed states produce a whole bunch of, mercenaries for hire that can do your own bidding. So the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Caucasus involved at least 200 militants from Syria that were flown in, bussed in, teleported in, whatever, by Turkey to kind of do Azerbaijan's dirty deeds. But Turkey, of course, was profiting off of this. And on the Armenian side, although it wasn't as prominent, we saw a number of Greek and Serbian mercenaries that went to fight for the Armenian side. And there was a few rumors of a few Kurds fighting on the Armenian side as well, although this hasn't been, of course, verified. So, the outbreak of war is kind of becoming very democratized, to the point where, if you really feel like you want to involve yourself in a conflict around the world, just, I don't know, buy yourself a cheap ticket on kayak.com, fly over, grab a gun, and, you too can be, part of the, part of the war effort. Of course, a lot of these conflicts are also accompanied by humanitarian disasters. So increasingly we find that strategies of ethnic cleansing and genocide take place when one group gains control over another. So within the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the disputed territory in Azerbaijan that had been controlled by Armenians for about 30 or so years, parts of it were just recently retaken by Azeri forces. And the towns and cities that the Azeri forces had taken quickly resulted in a mass exodus of Armenians that were fleeing from Azeri troops, fearing reprisals, murders, rapes, executions, all sorts of horrible things. So, you would think that in the age of globalization, we're all able to live together. Increasingly today, when one group takes over, a piece of territory from another, the demographics almost automatically change within 48 to 72 hours. And, the collapse of governmental authority certainly does not help in providing some kind of organizational leadership to the chaos that, of course, erupts. And we can't ignore the obvious truth here that many of these regional wars are really supported by external states and powers, right? We're talking about proxy wars. The Syrian civil war was, for the most part, a proxy war between, initially, the United States and, Syria and Iran. Then all of a sudden, Turkey gets itself involved. And right after that, Russia gets itself involved. And we stop thinking about the future status of a Syrian state, and we think more which sponsoring country with their own paid militants is going to win out. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan was also a proxy war. Azerbaijan has been unable to reclaim control over the Artsakh region for the last 30 years. It had been effectively controlled by Armenia. All of a sudden, Azerbaijan is given a blank check by Turkey, and they suddenly develop a backbone and do, in a matter of a month, what they could not achieve in the previous 3 decades. And in a parallel scenario where Russia decided to get itself involved and work on the Armenian side, I honestly believe that if Russia fought directly for Armenia, not only would the Artsakh region be defended, but additional territory would probably be claimed. So proxy wars are things that we need to take into account more and more in this day and age, too. So as much as I would like to suggest that with all of this known, efforts at resolving conflict have improved, advanced over the years, we are still, in front of many obstacles. We are still facing many, many inconvenient truths about conflict resolution that make it a noble profession, but also make those who practice it some of the most depressing people that I've ever met. And it's worth pointing out a few of these inconvenient truths, especially for those who are interested in going into the field. You got to know what you're going up against, and you got to know the realities of what currently exist. The first and probably the most important, and if you get absolutely nothing else from this lecture, get this. Conflict resolution is more about conflict management. And this is not just a little tongue-in-cheek cliche. We oftentimes look at the term conflict resolution and get hung up on that second term, resolution. Resolution implies some kind of, resolving, some kind of forward movement, some kind of reconciliation. And there are a number of, examples around the world where efforts at conflict resolution have been happening for years, if not decades. Peacekeeping troops, UN peacekeeping troops, US, Russian peacekeeping troops, whatever. They've occupied certain areas for in some cases as far back as the 60s, the 50s even, if we were to even think about the Suez Canal. So conflict management, I guess gets the job done. Conflict management is really the prevention of further conflict, but it doesn't resolve the underlying issues. And this is something that is far more pervasive in the world today than many of us would like to think. Because the second inconvenient truth explains that. Negotiated solutions rarely, if ever, produce optimal outcomes for all aggrieved parties. The problem is in conflict resolution that if we were just to envision, two groups, right? Group A and Group B, and they're seeking some kind of solution to their protracted conflict. Both are going into the negotiation scenario expecting to win everything against the other, right? The expectation that outcomes are absolute as opposed to relative. And when solutions are negotiated by third-party arbiters, and it doesn't matter whether it's the United Nations or the United States or Russia or anybody else like that, right? Third-party arbiters are going to look for some kind of middle ground, and they're going to try to find things that both sides can be happy on. But in order to do that, both sides are going to be at the same time disappointed, because the optimal outcomes for either side usually necessitate the other one capitulating entirely. So negotiated solutions might look good for the people who are doing the negotiating, and they might do good for the people interested in figuring out who's going to get the next year's Nobel Peace Prize. But for the people involved, you end up getting an outcome far less than what you expected going in. Because the involvement of third-party arbitration is almost always necessary, right? It is very, very, very rare in this day and age where the people who were actually involved in the conflict now decide to put aside their grievances and engage in some kind of reconciliation, some kind of resolution, right? In almost all cases, you need an outside arbiter. You need a third party. You need someone who's going to be much more objective in the field. But the problem with this involvement is that the third-party arbitration is at best going to be looking for a solution that doesn't disappoint both sides too much, and at worst might be somewhat loyal, sympathetic, supportive of one side over the other, but they like to advertise themselves as, representative of international justice, of the UN, of the EU, whatever. And, they're going to come up with some kind of solution that will be backed and supported by international law, but may very well, favor one side over the other. So, third-party arbitration is almost always necessary, but comes with their own risks and their own liabilities. Fourth inconvenient truth: gains are always relative, hardly ever zero sum. Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's not so much of an inconvenient truth. That should happen, right? Everybody should go to the table, expecting to hopefully come away with slightly more than half of what they wanted. And if that's the case, great. We've reached a solution. We can worry about the other, things in the coming years and decades. The problem is if gains are always relative, meaning that both sides have to benefit, rather than my benefit comes at your direct consequence, that may not be enough to get all sides to the table. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to bring all sides to the negotiating table. What does it take to get them to accept a ceasefire? What does it take to get them to send delegates to the negotiating table? Because once you go there, you already imply that you're willing to negotiate, and you are also willing to kind of bargain away some concessions over others. So what are you willing to give up in order to accept more non-negotiable terms? What are red line items that you will not negotiate? And what are some things that you could accept for the collective benefit of everyone, just for the sake of moving forward? If all of these things are part of your decision-making, then the ultimate peace agreement may produce something that neither side ultimately wanted. It's supposedly a win-win situation. But if you're a hardliner, if you're a nationalist, if it's all or nothing, it ends up being lose-lose. And the only people who end up winning are the arbiters that, are in very good qualification for next year's Nobel Peace Prize, right? The fifth one, and this is equally important to the first: proposed solutions for ending a war and stopping the killing are likely to create new problems. All right, now this, we can do an entire lecture just on this. We can do a whole class just on this. From the point of view of the peace negotiators, your primary objective, Monday morning, 8 o'clock, day one, is to end the war and stop the killing by any means possible. How do you go about doing that? How do you get the warring parties to end the war and stop the killing and enter the negotiation process? Usually, you end up saying there will be no return to the pre-conflict status quo. And you oftentimes have to guarantee that everyone stays exactly where they are, in control of whatever territory that they have captured or recaptured, in order to get to the negotiating table. What do you need to do? What costs do you need to spend? What concessions do you need to make in order to end the war and stop the killing? If that's your primary objective, is to avoid further deaths, you may end up having to acquiesce on a number of issues that will create further problems down the road. And at the risk of giving away the rest of the plot, ending the war and stopping the killing may end up actually undermining the state, may up actually weakening the internal dynamics of the state for whatever concessions and whatever proposals need to be given in order to somehow appease one side to, end up working with the other. The sixth, commitment to peace and stability rests on the changing interests of state governments. This is also very problematic because the people who signed that agreement might not necessarily represent the state in future governments. Oftentimes, people who sign a peace agreement oftentimes risk their own political careers, especially if they sign an agreement that is detrimental to one side's longevity over the others. As soon as they come back home from that peace agreement, they're thrown out of power, and they can be replaced by hardliners, by nationalists, by whoever that have no intention of honoring the peace agreement by trying to, gamble away for new high stakes in renewed conflict, whatever. So it's not enough to just simply get people to sign the document and shake hands. You got to actually implement this stuff. You got to make certain that this stuff somehow now is long-lasting, because there is a very high risk that the people who sign the peace agreement can be replaced for people who are more opportunistic and belligerent. And finally, promoting peace is different from practicing peace. There's a lot of people who feel that, all they got to do is voice support for some kind of peace agreement and say that the agreement needs to be implemented, it needs to be abided by, we hope that everybody will follow the rules of the law. Easier said than done. Unless you have leverage to actually force people to abide by those peace agreements, nothing will get accomplished. So whatever the stipulations are that both sides agreed to, you can't just simply, clink some champagne, say that you've, preserved peace in our time and demand your Nobel Peace Prize. No. You're only halfway there. Now you got to worry about practicing the peace, implementing the peace, making certain that people are, they live up to whatever terms that they agree to. And that's just not from one side, but that's from both sides as well. Because along with these 7 inconvenient truths come 2 critically important underlying issues. First, peace can only come through enforcement and regulation, and it cannot be perceived as a tool for hegemonic self-interest. In other words, in order for you to ensure that the peace agreement is implemented, those that designed the peace treaty, got everybody to the table, got everybody to sign, now has to work on implementing it. If that means peacekeeping troops, if that means holding both countries accountable, if that means threatening to resume war if one side defects, you got to be on top of that. You can't just simply assume that people are now going to live up to the document. There have been a number of peace agreements that have been immediately ignored the minute that everybody goes back home. The other problem with this is that if you are a third-party arbiter, you can't just simply overtly enforce this stuff. You can't make it seem like you're the one that controls both countries. You got to work through the national governments. You got to work through the governments that sign the agreement to make it look like they're the ones that are voluntarily and consciously going about doing it, right? Because conflict resolution addresses problems linked to protracted social conflict. In other words, it's not enough to get people to just sign a peace agreement to stop killing each other. You also gotta get them to go beyond that. You gotta get them to look at the underlying issues that we just talked about 10, 15, 20 minutes ago. There cannot be, in this day and age, any winners or losers anymore. And this might seem obvious to the student who is studying this, but to the people that are involved in the fight, if they're emotionally involved, if they're religiously involved, culturally, mnemonically involved, yeah, both sides have to be perceived as, somehow gaining something, right? But if your side is absolutely determined to make certain that the other side doesn't have a day to enjoy, no brunch to go to, then I'm sorry, but it's not going to work. So third-party arbitration needs to basically own the peace agreement all the way to the end. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where the wheels fall off the metaphoric wagon. Because a lot of times we get people to sign the peace agreement, and usually the UN or the EU or the US or to a lesser extent Russia. Russia's actually pretty good at making certain that this thing is implemented, right? Say what you want about Russia. They're pretty good about this. But you can't just get people to sign the document, shake hands, and go home and think everything's going to be great. It won't. The third-party arbiter has to basically own responsibility for the next couple of decades to make certain that the peace agreement is not only implemented, but that attitudes, beliefs, and values change. So I want to keep this lecture, sort of short and sweet. And I had a lot more to bring up, but I'm thinking to myself, it might be better to talk about examples and apply the problems of conflict resolution to our in-class discussion on Monday. That gives me an opportunity to kind of provide something akin to a semi-lecture, but also to get a sense of what you understand from the grand theoretical standpoint, and then we can apply that to examples. And I think also because it's been about an hour, and this is, look, it's the end of the semester, or we're getting close to it. I want you to just get the basic understandings of the issues in front of conflict resolution in international organization and the problems that present themselves within the context of trying to get the two or more aggrieving sides to the negotiating table. So what I'd like to do, if you're still listening, I want to ask a very small little homework assignment. And this assignment will effectively go towards your class participation, which some of you need. The assignment is very simple. I want you to email me what you got out of this lecture as the inconvenient truths of conflict resolution and 2 things that we need to know moving forward. It literally is nothing more than just let me see if you accessed the lecture, understood the material, and are you just simply able to repeat back to me what are some of the big points. Because I want to use these inconvenient truths and talking points within our discussion for Monday's class. And I think I'll save a lot of the examples and the nuances for that time. So once again, your homework assignment is very simple. I want you to email me with what are the inconvenient truths of conflict resolution. You can just simply number them, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many that they are, along with a couple of other things that we need to know when going into the general understanding of conflict resolution. Send that to me in an email by Monday. I'll look it over. If it's all accurate, you will earn a participation point, which some of you definitely need. And we will then look at specific examples in our class, either Monday afternoon or Monday evening. But if you walk away from this lecture with understanding the material that I just presented to you, you're in good shape, not only for this week's discussion, but for the ensuing material moving forward on human rights, environmental attention, and really the final elements of our discussion on international organization. So with all that said, enjoy the weekend. I look forward to your emails, and I look forward to speaking and working with you all early next week. Okay, take care, everyone.